Good day, gentlemen. I hope you have a great day. So the session today is around the clinical trial space and how ventures are actually navigating through clinical trials using digital solutions. So I'm having two great specialists. I'll let them first introduce themselves and their ventures before we can actually start with our this discussion that we have planned for today. Since Huren, I have you in the upper left corner of my screen, I'll let you first share before we go over to Martin. Please introduce yourself, your venture, and what you're doing. Thank you.
Hi, Dario. Thanks a lot, and thank you for the invitation to actually share our work. My name is Huren, and I'm a medical oncologist by training, by background, in clinical practice for more than 10 years. And I've made the decision to kind of build my startup. I started Oncoshot 3 years ago. And Oncoshot is actually working at the intersection of oncology, clinical trials, and data science. So we're a really kind of small niche area from the appearance of it, but there's a good reason for that, and that's because the level of detail and expertise in this domain requires effort to be taken in this space in the manner that we feel that we need to do. So today Oncoshot provides its core clinical trials matching capability in a SaaS-enabled marketplace, and we work with hospitals primarily and industry stakeholders on the other side. And we can always share the details later on as well. I'll stop there.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Huren. Martin.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So thank you, first of all, for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Martin Lim, co-founder and CEO of Onward Health Research. We're based in Singapore, and we are developing a digital clinical research platform. So what we operate in is basically creating the ability to run clinical trials digitally. And what we'll talk about a bit later is that much of this process is still happening on paper. It's still happening manually, and so we're moving that online. And our goals are really to increase access to be able to reach more people to participate in clinical research, and then also by operating in Singapore and then into ASEAN and other emerging markets to lower the cost of conducting clinical trials as well. So look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for the introduction from both of you. So taking first clinical trials probably as a very broad topic. For those listening in today, you may be familiar with the process. You basically need to find the cohort that you bring into your clinical trials, and then you need to navigate them through the entire clinical trial process, which is always a very tiring, very long process. It's very expensive for pharma companies as well out there, and therefore now navigating from the research clinical trials, so the RCTs, forwards to the decentralized clinical trials or clinical trials that are using digital solutions, are having a very huge opportunity for everyone kind of involved in it. So maybe to both of you to start this discussion, when you look into the clinical trials, how they're being executed, let's say in the United States versus Asia Pacific, do you see very huge differences? Are they more advanced in other parts of the globe as compared to Asia Pacific? And B, what might be some of the needs that Asia needs to provide, or countries across Asia Pacific would need to provide, and especially in Southeast Asia as well, to kind of step up their game and also get more access to clinical trials here as well for the patients that actually are in need of trying to participate in them?
So I'm happy to take a go at this first. I think if you want to look at it from the perspective of geographies, say the US versus APAC and specifically Southeast Asian countries. Another lens that we can also apply is the lens of industry stakeholders versus hospital partners, right? These are two important groups of stakeholders that come into play for clinical trials. Now, individual patients are the ones who are impacted at the level of the trial itself. They are the ones being enrolled, they have access to the drug, but they still have to do it within the framework of a healthcare provider, right? So fundamentally, the healthcare provider, the hospitals, is a very key stakeholder. And in the trial language, we call them trial sites. So it's sites and sponsors. Now, where the developed countries like US have really been a lot more advanced than the rest of the world is the adoption of technology solutions, primarily at the level of sponsors. Now, there's always been a big need and interest from sponsors to say, how do we actually reduce the cost of our inefficiencies? How do we accelerate the entire process? And how can technology help us? And this has been a discussion for the last decade, by the way. So you've seen a proliferation of clinical trials companies or software in the US, especially over the last 10 years. So today, if we were to go to the US market and say we are a clinical trials company, no one cares, because they've been sold that story for the last 10 years. You have to really differentiate yourself in terms of what's different. Now, that's at the level of sponsors, which is very mature, I believe, in the US market. At the level of the sites, while not across the board, given our experience and discussions with many of the cancer hospitals specifically, we see that there is some adoption of site-level solutions to make their matching process, their trial pipeline management process a lot more efficient. But we also see a gap where a lot of these smaller institutes don't really adopt solutions at the site level. So whatever solutions they end up using is really pushed from the sponsors. Now, that's one pattern that I tend to notice in the developed countries. If you take that to Asia and APAC, I think there's a significant gap. There's a stratification still though. If you compare countries like Korea and Japan, they have historically tried to look at leveraging their hospital data for insights and then to run trials. So they've done that, although of course the application of cloud-based technologies is something that they're trying to grapple with and to move towards. So that's something that they're moving towards, but the adoption has not been in that scale that we've seen in the US, for example. In Southeast Asia, we are dealing with a very entirely different problem. We have problems both at the level of, primarily the level of the sites, where firstly, the issue is more, I believe, digitalization. A lot of the basic healthcare data, the patient data that we have, is not even digitized. It's on hard copies. So there's a variance across different countries, but it's a huge problem. Now, the second part is what you then do with the data. Because the healthcare institutions, even those who have been using EMRs, have been so siloed, they have no way to interface their data with applications on the cloud that can actually provide the right analytics to manage patient populations to trials. So there are two levels here that is required as foundational issues for the hospitals in Southeast Asia. So I would kind of categorize that in this way. At the last level, if you think beyond sites, sponsors, it's patients. I think awareness there's a big difference, but I'll leave it at that. Patients in developed countries like the US are a lot more aware. Patients in Asia, let's just say that they're not searching for trials enough as well.
Huren?
Yeah, so I think Huren touched on a lot of important points to highlight the differences between what's happening here in Southeast Asia and the US. And so actually, before moving to Singapore about 2.5 years ago, I spent many years in the US. I spent most of my life in the US. And I actually ran a site network running clinical research at sites, helping physicians be able to conduct these clinical trials in California. And so I've had the chance to see kind of both sides of it. And the big difference that I see here is that the ecosystem, and I think Huren kind of alluded to this, is much more developed and advanced in the US. There are EMR systems being used in almost all of the hospitals in the United States. So technology adoption is quite far along. And if you look at these sponsors, these pharma companies, these medical device companies, they all push their clinical trial activity to the US or Western Europe or in Asia, it's more or centered around Japan, Korea, and China. Not nearly as much in Southeast Asia. And if you look at the numbers, for example, if you're looking at clinicaltrials.gov and where trials are being registered, there are something like 7,000 industry-sponsored trials being run in the U.S. right now, versus in all of Southeast Asia, it's below 1,000. And it's double the population here. And so how we look at this is we want to build up capacity, capability in the ecosystem. We want to provide sponsors with options to run their trials in Southeast Asia. And I think to Huren's point also, we look to help enabling sites, not just with technology, not just with a digital platform that they can use as an option instead of paper, but also by helping and bringing in other partners to do things like training and, getting international standards so that the investigators and their supporting staff can run these trials in the same way, in the same level of quality that would be done in these other more developed ecosystems.
So do you see the issue therefore be more towards the provider side, considering that they are not as technically savvy or not enabled, or on the sponsor side, because their interest is not so much in this part of the world as of now?
What I'm seeing is it's a bit of a cycle, right? The sponsors, we've talked to some sponsors, and one of the countries that we are starting with is Indonesia. And some sponsors, when you talk to them, quite frankly, they won't bring their trials to Indonesia. And there's a lot of levels of issues there with trust. We've heard stories of people putting deposits in for an initial trial to be funded, and then the funds just go away. The startup times for some of these projects take a long time, and there are other challenges of getting the studies, up and running. So the sponsors have an aversion to some countries in Southeast Asia, and so that's where we're helping to sort of advance the ecosystem. Again, kind of to my point earlier, right? To build trust and capacity and capability.
Excellent. So we kind of heard, or we kind of alluded towards the awareness of digital, of the clinical trials being run, but also the access of it. There's always a third A, it's the affordability of it. Looking into running a clinical trial in Southeast Asia, for instance, so you see this also being a huge issue, considering when we're looking into recruitment costs, for instance, it almost makes 30% of the entire clinical trial. Do we have the same issue here, or would it actually be exceptionally more affordable in this part of the world as compared to when you run it anywhere else? To both of you. I'm opening it up.
Sure, I can take that. So I'm most familiar with oncology clinical trials, so I can share my experience on that. So oncology clinical trials are really expensive trials in general, and that kind of and if you think about the cost, it's also about making sure that many of these trials, which are also multinational trials, which are run across multiple countries for the purpose of having an inclusive patient population, so that at the end of the day, when you go past your trials and you get approval, you can say that you've got a representative group of patients. You've got Caucasians, you've got Asians, for example, and this should be widely, the data can then be used for regulatory authority approval in those countries, right? So these countries actually need to have representation. And when you actually compare the cost, quite clearly there's a big gap. Asia is a lot more expensive. Within Asia, there is stratification once again. Countries like Singapore, Korea, and Japan are generally a lot more expensive than, say, other countries like, for example, maybe even China or India. But you also see that the kind of trials that are going to each of these countries are quite different. For example, sponsors may be willing to pay more money in a more expensive Asian site at the end of the day, simply because they are more assured of the quality with their collaborators there, right? But fundamentally still, from the level of sites that we speak to in Asia, they really do believe that their cost as a top Asian center is still considerably less than the cost to pharma at the top US centers or the top European centers. So now that's one of the reasons. Cost is a factor, but I think another big factor is actually patient representation. So while sponsors may need to avoid, Asian countries, may want to avoid Asian countries due to a lack of quality, they also still have to look at Asian countries because they need the patient populations at some point to get their drugs cleared and approved, right? So that is a necessity. It's just that how do we put these pieces together and find that balance to make it sensible for sponsors to actually start investing more into running more trials in Asia confidently. So I think that's really the issue here.
Yeah, and on the topic of cost, I think I think there are a couple things that we're seeing technology be able to help. Number one, it's a big shift in the way the industry is run. And so with COVID, one of the things that changed with how clinical trials operate is what's called the monitoring of sites. So clinical research or contract research organizations that are in charge of overseeing large global clinical trials, they have to check in on the sites on an ongoing basis to ensure that the quality is being that the trial is being conducted the way that it is designed. And so before COVID, these would be physical visits. People would go on a plane, visit the site, spend a few days each week to check in on what's going on. With COVID, a lot of this had to move remotely, which actually significantly reduced the cost of this part of the conduct of the trial, right? So you mentioned that recruitment was 30% of the cost. I think the monitoring costs were also nearly around that amount. And so that was a shift that a lot of the industry was not willing to make before COVID, but now are, I think, quite accustomed to doing remote monitoring. So that has helped. The other thing that I think digital solutions can help with is the retention of participants. So once you recruit these participants, keeping them engaged, keeping them in these sometimes 1 or 2 year long study protocols is very important, because if they drop out halfway through, that data is now not useful, and you have to start all over again and recruit another patient, which is very, very costly to the entire process. So I think those are two things that we're seeing also that technology can help with to lower the cost.
Excellent. So technology is really then the linchpin that we are seeing. So we do always have tons of concerns when it comes to implementing new technologies, therefore exporting data. Most of the platforms that these days are being set up within the digital therapeutics, within the digital research clinical trial space, need to be decentralized. So we are then talking about the entire model of federated learning models. You're basically deploying certain APIs within the hospital side, but you're actually running the code in a totally different country. Therefore, the data are not exported from the hospital side. How do you think that, let's say, going into remote Indonesia, trying to attract a hospital to become future ready, if they don't even have the capacities or not even the network to actually install such systems, what would need to happen first? So how can we overcome the gap that we have from the technology side to actually make the hospitals future ready to become also part of this larger network of the trial side? Because there are lots of patients out there, right? Maybe to Martin first.
Yeah. So what I mean, our approach to it is that, with electronic systems, there's two main ways that you can deploy them, right? The first one is on premises deployment. So the hospitals are required to make a capital investment. They buy servers, they have to hire the staff to maintain it, and then they actually have to physically maintain it and make sure that it's secure and protected from cyber attacks. The other way to do it is now a lot of these companies are moving, including ours, in deploying the solutions into the cloud. And so I think from an adoption perspective, it makes it easier for hospitals to consume our platform if it's available through the cloud. And then the other part, particularly in Indonesia, and to the point you made, Dario, about remote locations, is that the technology that enables a physician who's operating maybe at a large hospital, and it allows them to then reach out to these more remote areas, so that a lot of the clinical research can actually be conducted more remotely while being overseen by a physician, in a big city, in a large academic or even a private hospital.
So we do see the shift of, let's say you're having let's call it like a very developed hospital that is working with smaller clinics as satellite clinics to kind of collaborate on these sorts of solutions already, or we do not see this yet. Do we see, for instance, I don't know, no, Mensa Group is probably a bad example, Siloam hospitals, that they are working with smaller clinics across the remote islands of Indonesia, actually now start partnering together, and they're deploying their solutions. Do we see this already?
I haven't seen it in research yet. Those are things that we are working towards. We have seen some examples. I've seen some large MNCs, basically with medical device, do that model with certain areas of medicine where they do partner with a hospital. And then in Indonesia, they have these community clinics. There are 10,000 of them spread throughout the country in very rural parts of the country. And so they have used technology to connect doctors. In this particular case, it was, I think, obstetrics. And so it was connecting obstetricians in the hospitals and being able to see things, ultrasounds being done and monitoring of mothers, expectant mothers and things like that remotely. So that, I think, we're trying to move over into the research arena.
So I could share my thoughts on that as well. From the perspective of, at least in oncology clinical trials, we've received quite a few interested parties who wanted to do remote oncology clinical trials. But the biggest roadblock has been in terms of regulation. Basically, when a lot of these oncology trials were started, it was not on the basis of, yes, we are going to use a decentralized model. And for example, during COVID, as was encountered by one of our biggest hospital partners here, there were patients who would typically be traveling from China or Thailand to Singapore just to get access to the clinical trial. And now, because of COVID, they couldn't actually travel, right? But they still had to be part of that clinical trial. And this was a scenario where the regulatory process was not in place to manage it. But out of the critical need to continue with the trial, they had to figure out a way. So the good thing was that thankfully, these medications were tablets. They were not IV infusions. So there was a logistics process that could be worked out together with the sponsor, and the oncologist would get on a very telemedicine model to actually check on how are you doing, capture the data points that is required as part of the trial. And for those aspects of care that was required, they actually coordinated with the local physician there who was comfortable enough to actually manage that. Now this was possible as a very ad hoc basis, to continue access to the patient. But I think fundamentally there still needs to be a lot more understanding of what is the regulatory framework in place to be able to scale this if this was needed. Now, because the question that has arisen from that is that many of the top cancer hospitals in the region want to be able to partner with oncologists or specialists outside of their country to be able to help and provide clinical trial options in countries where the patients may not have access to any clinical trials. And interestingly, there are also, in a reverse manner, specialists from lesser developed countries, or rather countries where there are no trials, who are seeking to get access to trials in Singapore. That's because the trial is being run from here. And so we've got this problem statement that is coming up, right? But now we need to bridge that regulatory aspect of things. So there's always going to be this technology readiness that we already have access to. But as part of clinical trials, I think the regulatory frameworks need to be sped up, which in Asia may take a bit longer than usual.
Yeah, looking even into the digital health regulatory frameworks that we've seen across the region, there are not many countries that actually have one in place. China has one. Japan has one, South Korea has one, Singapore has one. Indonesia is developing theirs. I don't think it's done. My last update I got earlier this year, it wasn't fully completed yet. But we do see many more countries actually now moving that into that direction, trying to integrate also their own regulatory framework. Okay, nice. So now we talked about the access of it. We talked about the affordability of it. We talked about technologies, and now a bit on the regulatory side. There are two more points that I want to highlight again. The trust issues. So we spoke about trust issues earlier from a sponsor side. Do we see the same sort of issues also on the patient side? Do patients also not trust how clinical trials are currently being run? And what could happen, and how could also your two platforms potentially help bridge that trust issue that we are seeing from a patient point of view as well?
I think one of the things that I've seen with COVID is that now, clinical trials has become a household term, right? People now understand the purpose of it. They understand better how it works. And so it's become less of a foreign concept. So I think in that sense, it has helped in what we do every day. That now brings that to light. But, trust issues are huge, particularly with patient populations. And then when you take into consideration sort of other cultural factors, religious factors, and things like that as well. I would kind of highlight one example I've seen in Malaysia through Clinical Research Malaysia, for example. They have a nationwide campaign called I Am Aware, and they have events that they do to raise awareness about clinical research and dispel some of the myths around it and encourage participation and education around it. So, programs like that, I think, would be quite important in getting past that barrier of trust and encouraging enrollment into clinical trials. I think the other is that, and we've did this in the past in the United States, where we look for patient advocacy groups and build trust with those groups. So it could be with Alzheimer's, could be with oncology, diabetes, and it becomes more where the clinical trial is just another option in healthcare. It's not so segregated as, there's standard of care healthcare and then this clinical research where you're treated like a guinea pig. It's not like that at all. It's just that if you have this diagnosis, you have these options, or there's also this clinical research option you can participate in safely, with the oversight of your physician.
Huren, before you start, I want to add one more question towards your side. When you are looking from the oncology point of view, then you have the additional issue that people don't necessarily want to talk about that they have cancer, and therefore they don't want to become a burden to their people. So you don't just have the trust issue towards maybe the clinical trials, but you also don't have the, let's say, the guts to actually talk about it at all. So how do you then raise the awareness that they should try to be part of a clinical trial, and then overcome the trust that you have on the other side? Might make the question a bit more complex.
So I can share this. Actually, it makes sense to actually share this from the perspective of an oncologist. Talking to patients in terms of their cancer treatment. Now, in oncology specifically, just like what Martin has mentioned, in fact, it's very much the case where clinical trials is actually that other half of the entire treatment landscape. When a patient actually enters the door, the goal should be for any oncologist to be able to say, look, here are your options today in terms of standard therapies, and here are your options in terms of clinical trials. If this treatment doesn't work and you progress on your current treatment, these are going to be your options as standard therapies, and these may be your options as clinical trials. And if we can actually map that out for them, the assurance that they have in terms of what they can have access to is tremendous. And this was an important part of why we set up to build the platform very early as a trial matching tool. Now, going back to the problem of the patient's perception. Now, I see two patterns. The first pattern is the Asian patient population that tends to be a lot more elderly and maybe not so well educated. Now, for them, usually, clinical trials is perceived as really a guinea pig kind of thing, right? Where doctor, are you giving me something that hasn't been tested? Am I a lab rat? Am I a guinea pig? So that's that one layer of discussion. But what's also interesting is always remember that the patient who comes and sees the physician, there's someone behind them, right? That's a family member. That's a loved one who usually wants the best for the patient. So sometimes we're able to kind of bridge that patient's lack of perception or knowledge or awareness by educating the family about the treatment options. But it's still a bit of a hard game to play because you still fundamentally need to convince the patient that the trial is a good option to consider. And if the patients don't want it, then you're up against a brick wall in that sense. But in Asia today, that's changing because as the next generation of patients are more well-informed, more educated, and they're able to actually find information, they're open to this. But I'll tell you one thing, from the oncology patient perspective, general awareness and even the desire to search for information pre-COVID, it was really bad. I'll give you a good example and an objective one at that. So today, Oncoshot considers itself as a B2B platform. We are providing our service to industry and sponsors, but we actually started off in a B2C model where we wanted to be able to open up the ability for an individual patient to put in some details of their cancer profile, find trials, and to be able to bring that to the oncologist if they wanted to map out their landscape of trials, right? When we actually went about the process of trying to acquire just visitors, leads, who would come in, and then the next step, of course, was to create a profile. The cost of not customer acquisition, but the cost of profile acquisition for us was around $300. And we still didn't know if we were going to get a customer at the end of the day. And that just goes to show you that at the ground level, still there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of awareness. We are barely scratching the surface.
Thank you. Martin, probably a similar point of view from your side. When we're comparing a bit what was pre-COVID, and then everyone heard about, okay, there are massive clinical trials now being run for vaccines across the globe. So I believe within a week, everyone from our 7.5 billion people on this globe now know what a clinical trial is. Have you seen that there was also a shift of mindset, more sponsors reaching out to you, more patients reaching out to your platform? Have you seen any step up, kind of similar time frame during that time?
So we have not. I mean, in during that time, at the same time, we've seen almost the opposite, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, and it's starting to come back up now. But all of the hospitals around the world for a time in early 2020, probably early to mid 2020, had to stop all of their clinical trial activity. And during that time also, a lot of the projects that we had in our pipeline all just dried up completely. And so now we are starting to see that pick up. I think towards the end of 2020 and into 2021, we started to see that pick up more. I guess in terms of perception, like a public perception or patient perception of it, in general, they're more aware of what a clinical trial is, but I think there's still a bit more to go in terms of getting rid of the connotation that you're still an experiment or a lab rat, right? And so, and that's where those patient awareness programs, really come in and would make a difference. Excellent,
thank you. I think we're almost at the end of our time. I have to hand over at 4:30 p.m. Maybe one last question that I want to throw towards both of you. When we are now taking, again, the patient, sponsor, the governments, the hospitals, who of these needs to maybe step up the game in order to make clinical trial or digital clinical trials more receptive in Asia Pacific? Who's currently the biggest linchpin, the biggest bottleneck in order to move clinical trials to the next level also in this part of the world?
So I can start that off, and I guess I would say between the three of them, it would be, especially in Southeast Asia, I think it would be the governments. They have the biggest ability to influence how this turns out for their country. And then, back to what Huren was saying about how the industry is set up. If you look at sponsors, especially these big pharma sponsors, when they're choosing where to run their clinical trial, they basically have the entire world to select from. And they're looking at where the patients are, but also they're looking at the regulations. They're looking at the speed to getting their trials up and running. So a Ministry of Health would evaluate whether that protocol can be run in the country, whether it would be allowed to be run in the country, whether that investigational drug can be used in the clinical trials in the country. And a lot of the countries that do the best have either had longstanding pathways to approve this in a timely manner, or they've recently developed pathways. So a good example is China. It used to take 2 years to get a trial approved to get started. And I forgot the exact number now, but it's reduced by something like 75%. So now you can probably get it up and running in something like 6 months instead of this 2-year time frame. And to a drug company, that's extremely valuable. So the governments would really have a big say in that.
Great.
I agree with Martin, and I would just want to add that at this initial phases of setting up that ecosystem, it really has to be guided by the government and regulatory authorities, to set up that framework and structure. But as soon as that's done, the responsibility is really at the level of the sites, at the hospitals, to have the capability to convince sponsors that I can manage those trials. I have the right combination of medical expertise, solutions, and data to run this as efficiently as I can and with the expertise that I can. And then it becomes the responsibility of the sites to differentiate themselves. So if sites actually don't take the effort to think about how can I improve my clinical trials unit, its functions, how can I look at my data and accelerate the time it takes to pick up the right patient population, to also kind of decide on what trials to bring to my site, right? In this particular country, you might have a very unique cancer patient population with a particular type of, genomic feature that you want to be able to address. If you don't know what your population constitutes, how are you going to bring the right trials to succeed on the trials efficiently? And so it becomes a conversation that really requires for the sites to level up. I think if you look at different countries, you're going to see variations across Asia. A lot of countries need to level up on their government kind of capabilities. And we also have a few countries that now are at the level of the sites, what they can do to improve themselves. So I think it's, as I agree, government first, and then it becomes a site responsibility to make sure that they're doing a better job over time.
Thank you. So with this, I want to bring it up for all of my government participants today, or sponsor, or a site to reach out to these two gentlemen. They've done a major job. I think if you ever want to run a clinical trial or want some input, these two can probably answer all of your questions. At least they've answered all of mine. So thank you, Huren, thank you, Martin, for your insights today. And with this, I would like to give back to my charming colleague, Anna, to announce our next panel. Thank you both.
Thank you, Dario, Huren, and Martin. Very interesting session indeed. On this very critical portion of the treatment development. So thank you both. Again, I repeat what Dario was saying. Feel free to reach out to both of them. Again, the means are either via the chat or the form that Melvin has shared with you, the Q&A session, or just go back to our website and you'll find their details there.